Hi everyone, and welcome to a special session where we have Pavithra. She is an astrobiologist and assistant professor at Aqua. Our friendship goes long way. We started together our PhD at Virginia Tech, where she was the school person who was working on astrophysical models, modeling Ceres, moon, and so on. And I was working on the boring stuff that was Earth. And today I'm really hoping that we can have a very nice discussion. We also have Terry and Vishal here. Terry also being an astrophysicist in his pastime, and we can have a very nice conversation around the astrophysics, astrobiology, and then Chandrayaan-3. Pavithra will be also talking about the geology of the moon. And then, of course, as our main focus is deep learning and AI, so space science and AI. So thanks, Pavithra, for being here.
Yes, thank you, Tanishta, for the introduction. I am actually very happy to be a part of this podcast. So a little bit about me. Of course, Aqua, as Tanishta mentioned, is actually stands for Amity Center of Excellence in Astrobiology. It is a center at Amity Institute of Biotechnology, which is in Mumbai. So I am an assistant professor at Aqua. Like Tanishta mentioned, we actually began our journey together during our PhD. So just to give you a little bit of insight about my background and how I came about to be more of an astrobiologist, which is kind of a upcoming field these days in science in India and all over the world. So actually, I did begin with a physics background, my bachelor's and my master's. So a lot of my project was actually in astrophysics. But then I converted to a planetary geophysics project, which was done at Virginia Tech, where I worked on a NASA-based project to understand the volcanoes on the surface of Mars. So a lot of my research actually involved 3D modeling and simulation of the mantle and the crust to actually see how much melt was being produced on in the internal structure of Mars and how they actually make it to the surface. Now, what was very interesting, the geophysical aspects of that project was we had a very good sense of how old Mars was because we couldn't see a lot of changes in the topography or the crustal features of Mars. So we knew there was a clear separation between the southern and the northern hemispheres. So we also knew that Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in our solar system, was also formed really early on because there were no crustal changes after that, not too much, except for isolated volcanism. So a lot of my work involved modeling this melt that came from inside the mantle and made it to the surface, and also timing of that volcanism. So the geophysical aspects involved understanding viscosity, the temperature, the pressure, constants, the parameters, and actually to place it at such a time where it is possible because Mars has no tectonic plates as we know it. So which makes it very different from our own planet. So this was my main focus. After Mars, I moved on to the dwarf planet Ceres, which is an icy body, which we consider also very fascinating. There's a NASA Dawn mission.
Ceres is a moon for Jupiter, right?
No, Ceres is a dwarf planet, which we see between Mars and Jupiter.
Oh, okay.
So it's in the asteroid belt. So it's an icy body. Yes. Yes. What made Ceres very interesting and still is we believe it's existed for a very, very long time. So understanding its history could give us some more insights into how the solar system formed and maybe what were some of the conditions early on in our solar system. So, so that was a little bit about my PhD. Then I moved to hydrothermal systems during my postdoc, where I moved to studying more with about the mid-Atlantic ridge. So again, the geophysical aspects of that was also very fascinating because we knew there was something that was heating up the mid-oceanic ridge. And why do we have these black smokers and what makes that very fascinating?
But that's on the, like you're talking about Earth now, right?
Yes, yes, I'm talking about Earth. But what is very interesting is how that ties in with maybe Mars analog studies, the geophysical aspects of it. For example, the craters that we see on our planet.
Yeah.
Can we tie that in with the craters that we see on Mars? For example, if life did exist, or maybe life is a stretch, but if water did exist early on in Mars's history, we believe craters would be a good place to start looking for that kind of organic chemistry, the water structure. So studying the crater structures over here was also a part of my postdoc. So we were looking at how a crater evolves, what kind of hydrothermal system do you require to have a system, how long does it last, and applying that to Mars analog studies. So applying that to a system like Mars, when craters were formed really early on, could the water have existed early on if Mars had had an atmosphere or maybe a stronger gravitational force, since the gravity is very less. So that was one of actually a very interesting way and a switch to my astrobiology aspect, because when you think about it, when you think about water, you obviously tend to tie that in with, okay, did life exist? Could it have existed in some form? Or if you don't want to consider it as life, could organisms exist at those temperatures, at those pressures, things like that. So that's what ties in with astrobiology.
Okay.
Very interesting. You know something, it sparks my interest because back, this is 30 years ago. I'm pretty sure Europa was part of your study as well, the Jupiter's moon.
Yes,
because
actually,
that's where, now this is a very old memory, so I hope I'm using the right terms. The hydrothermal vents, which we have in Earth, that is where you get hydrogen and oxygen. Europa, however, although it lacks the hydrothermal vents, there is this process of serpentinization. Is that correct? Or am I using, because that's where the rock formation, right? The geology, where you have the hydrogen and oxygen. So did you study that as well? Because Europa has been like massive. So, everyone is fascinated with Mars, but a lot of those similarities, despite the lack of the hydrothermal vents in Europa, people are still fascinated about Europa.
Yes, so thank you for bringing that up. That's actually a very interesting study as well. That is, you're right. So even early on, Europa, even moons like Enceladus were actually topics and are still topics, especially for a lot of the missions. Now, one of the differences that we like to consider, that we understand, is Europa and Enceladus has more of an icy crust, an icy mantle. So something like Ceres. So we don't believe that it's being fueled by a magma source, which is what we consider for our planet, and maybe even early Mars. But one of the very interesting things about Europa and Enceladus is the fact that it has a huge planet which provides the tidal forces.
Correct.
And those tidal forces are so strong that they actually do cause these kind of isolated plumes. In this case, it would be a plume of ice mixture. And some of the very interesting missions that NASA has going on is actually to send, like not a rover, but to actually collect some of those organic material that you actually see from these plumes and then understand them. So you're right. I think hydrothermal might not be the exact term in that case, but definitely the tidal forces which do cause a lot more of activity that happens inside Enceladus and Europa.
Fascinating. It remains a very fascinating field. I mean, I'm really glad that, you're able to share and especially now with this massive sort of, boost for India, when we landed on the southern pole of moon, I'm sure it'll create a lot of new wave of people taking a lot of interest in not only India's sort of authoritative position, but also pushing more people into this discipline. And I'm sure you guys are really enjoying this great sort of recognition, which of course India deserves, rightfully deserve.
Yes, definitely. I mean, Chandrayaan-3, especially the landing, was a huge moment for the country and for the world, especially since no one's ever planned a landing at the South Pole. So if we consider the geology of Moon, for example, it's a little similar to Mars in the sense it hasn't changed much. And the most accepted theory of how the Moon formed is a Mars-sized planetoid impacted our planet really early on. They call it as Theia. And we believe that that became our own satellite, which is the Moon. A number of reasons this theory is actually accepted by the community, or is the most popular, I want to say, is because the chemical composition that you see between the Moon and our planet is very similar. And it also has a very similar spin orbit that we have. So if it had been captured, like some of the other moons from some of the other giant planets, gas giants, then it should have had a very different composition. So again, landing on the Moon, and why Moon is interesting is because the surface of the Moon hasn't changed much. So early on, with respect to the geologic time scale, most of the way that we characterize any planet is usually due to the impact craters or the formation of volcanism. So on Mars, it was mostly the crustal dichotomy and the impact craters. On the Moon, we don't observe a lot of volcanoes, or at least active volcanism. We have isolated places where you have this kind of geologic activity, but you don't have a tectonic plate, so you don't have the geologic activity. So what made the Moon very interesting, first off, is obviously it's our own Moon. So landing on the Moon has always been a very fascinating topic, as the world knows, for more than 50 years. So as we call it, the space race, there was a lot of countries trying to, get their hands on landing. But landing on the Moon is not just because of competition, but also Moon is the closest thing we have, the most feasible option that we have to understand how our planet formed, maybe give a little bit more insight. The craters on the Moon, especially the South Pole, the reason the South Pole is super fascinating is because there are certain parts of these craters that have remained in permanent darkness. They have never actually had the impact of sunlight, which means temperatures can go as low as minus 270 degrees centigrade. So it's very, very cold. And the gravity on Mars is only 1.6 approximately meters per second square, which means water ice can remain stable to some extent. So if you, again, it's always usually, looking for signs of water or something like that. So having these craters, especially a part of the crater in complete darkness, where water ice could have been a possibility, is what the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter actually began, the NASA mission, which was really early on. So using that data, we have decided and we planned to land in a location, especially the South Pole, which could actually collect this fascinating data. Unfortunately, it's also not a very long-lived mission, because being in the polar regions, one can imagine the amount of the temperatures, how cold it can get. So the survival of the mission is not as extensive as some of the other missions that have gone. But this is the reason the South Pole is very interesting, and it's also comparatively challenge to land there. So
awesome. If I may, just adding, obviously the new technologies or techniques that we use to understand this better, how much of in your modeling techniques, how much of AI is being used? Because right now it's rampant, it's prevalent, right? Even the black hole, which was reconstructed, they had used machine learning, a cluster of computers to do that. So can you describe a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So first thing I would like to say is AI is definitely the upcoming, and obviously if not upcoming, it's definitely what we depend on a lot these days. For example, on a funny note, I would like to say that ChatGPT is being used a lot by our students here to write emails and documentation, which we frown upon being a university. So AI as such is actually definitely the future. And now, if you want to consider something like the Chandrayaan mission itself, the Pragyan rover that
Yeah.
comes from, so the AI, we are hugely dependent on AI, especially for the initial data collection that it does. And it's something that we cannot live without, especially in space exploration, considering that at some point we want to explore other planets, maybe far in the future colonize, or maybe even set up a colony. AI is definitely the way to go because of the data collection that it do, the navigation, all of those, the other insights that it can actually provide is actually something that we hugely dependent on these days. And one thing I also want to say is at Amity University, Mumbai, we also tried, well, not an AI, but we've also come up with a rover of sorts that we have considered, especially in places like Ladakh, which we consider as a Mars analog location. So we were fortunate enough to try a rover that we had built here. So those are the emerging steps, I want to say. I think that would definitely lead to AI being used a lot more, especially to project the safety, the security, the sample collection, the data collection, the navigation, everything else would actually be hugely dependent on that. But the human component is also, at least I personally feel the human component is very required as well.
I think it's the human and machine interaction, because as much as learning, for us, learning is the way we reinforce it to improve upon our tasks and be efficient, right? But our limitation is, as biological, also product of hydrocarbon, we need rest and sleep, where we can only function once we are awake. But when you have a machine that has its, you're teaching itself, self-learning, supervised or unsupervised learning techniques, it can start performing those functions while the human agility is perhaps, even if you're too exhausted, even if a large team of people focusing on certain tasks, then you can have your robots do those exploratory tasks, right? I don't know if I hope in some future we might be doing micro drilling activities. We want to understand more, we want to explore, we want to go deeper, right? So that's where I'm really hoping that this will be much more practical tool than just a fancy tool. And sure, I mean, human has to be in control because we are very curious ourselves. So I'm sure we will keep and stay in control that way.
Yes, one of the interesting things actually between Chandrayaan-3 and the previous missions also is Chandrayaan-3 was a lot more, from what I understand, AI driven. So it would be wrong to say the success rate as such, but obviously the chances of failure, or the chances of something going wrong at that point was had reduced quite a bit because of AI. And some of the the landing process, the success rate of missions in general, we've kind of seen could definitely be related to AI driven missions and the data that's being collected and sent back. So that's a big part of it.
Pretty cool. And what are you doing then here on planet Earth? When you get the data, you have to crunch, you have to analyze. I know for sure here in the Netherlands, in the region where I live, we have, there is, a technique they use radio waves to also, I forgot the name of the company. It's pretty big here, and the world's leading astronomers and astrophysicists also come here. And I visited their facility. They have like massive clusters of NVIDIA supercomputers and are building their own data centers. How are you looking at, or how do you foresee the use of, one is to use AI as a technique and you need a laptop. The other is to be able to crunch and mine vast quantities of data, because when you're collecting data, it's not like collecting email information or database information of
Right.
customers. It is massive. It will have multiple modalities. Is there something in plan, or how do you use, which facility do you use to actually crunch, mine, and make sense out of that data?
So, okay, so there's kind of two answers to this. So if we looked at missions as such, we've already got some of the initial data. For example, ISRO put up on their website that sulfur was found on the surface of the moon, which actually opens up a whole other can of interesting questions. So getting that data, especially the big data that we talk about, in my case, when it's modeling and simulation, a lot of the computational modelings that we do involves having huge, enormous amounts of data, because when it comes to planetary science, especially in 3D modeling, you are trying to work on the project in a reverse direction. So you know what you can see, and then you are trying to create. So that in itself involves huge amounts of data that you're trying to work with. So, you know what you can see currently, and then when you try to go a reverse, just like uranium decay, for example, or any of the radioactive decay elements that we have. So that alone, especially if you're trying to see through 4.3 billion years, as long as the solar system existed, whether it's Mars or the moon, that itself talks about this enormous data. So depending on the time scale that we're trying to analyze, there are different softwares that use different kind of data sets.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work that I did was actually more on a Unix system, which involved a very strong, which was actually also written by University in California. So where they collected this input that you give, and you get tons of data, and you just have to figure out what are the right parameters for you to get your final result. If you're looking at something on a shorter scale, like a smaller scale, like the crustal impacts, then you work with a smaller set of data, because you're just looking at a shorter time period, and you also don't have to go deep into the planet as such. So I want to say it varies. There are softwares that help understand this. But computational programming obviously is a big yes. It's definitely beneficial to have that. Even if you don't have it, you learn it in the process, like I did. So we use this data to scientifically improve our knowledge about what's there, but also to collaborate with other nations, maybe for future missions, where you can predict, or at least try to understand, because you have a much clearer picture about the moon surface, for example, and then you try to use that to just improve your knowledge more about it. And then for future missions, it's usually actually very beneficial.
And how much are commercial companies also interested in these projects? Because we know that Amazon, Google, and Virgin Airways, they also have these ambitions, but also possess perhaps more superior labs and financial resources. Has there been any participation with what you are doing, and perhaps what you know about Chandrayaan, that there's been contribution or participation by these commercial entities?
So in India, space exploration is definitely booming now. Also, these kind of private commercial organizations are definitely taking a much bigger interest. One of the biggest, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. One of the biggest advantages are, just like Elon Musk, there are a lot of companies that are coming about by themselves, and they are willing to do very simple experiments, like let's say microgravity. For example, when you talk about astrobiology, you want to know how a specific plant or an animal or what kind of cultures can survive in those kind of gravity. So there are a lot of private companies that are definitely promoting this a lot more these days. So there are ways where these experiments are being done. Some of them let you, they actually can bring the sample back, which is hugely beneficial when you talk about space travel. Some of them you can only analyze the sample as it goes into space, but you really can't get the sample back. So depending on what part of the experiment you're interested in, it works. Now, they are obviously a little bit faster than certain government organizations because you don't have to go through the red tape as much. But also cost is something that, because they're private organizations, so you've got a balance of both.
Understand. Interesting. I have so many other questions, but I'm looking at Vishal and Tanisha. You also have questions for
No,
Pavithra?
I think this is a really good conversation going on between two astrophysicists and one
I have a
astrobiologist.
very simple question. Why South Pole?
Yes. So South Pole is where we believe that ice has existed in a very in a frozen condition, or what we call as permafrost layer usually. So with the South Pole, half of the South Pole has actually remained in absolute darkness, has never seen the sun. So when you are not exposed to the sun, you don't have any interactions with sunlight, heat, temperature, anything of that sort. So when you have these ice cap regions which are in complete darkness, they're usually the target because you have ice layer. So they're usually the targets for usually astrobiological missions, or to understand the composition. So that's why they usually go for the South Pole compared to the equator or some other part.
There is a Chinese mission also that succeeded. Was it 2 years ago in the South Pole, right? They're still there, or has that been?
No one's landed at the South Pole, from my understanding. There have been missions that have orbited the South Pole. They've collected data. But if you look at the landings from either Russia, China, or the US, we being the fourth country, you notice that a lot of them are actually towards other craters, or more towards the equator, or maybe a little bit more the north and the south. But the actual South Pole, Chandrayaan-3 has been one of the first to actually land and not just orbit. So
okay, that's interesting. So in a way, this is really pioneering.
yes.
So what kind of? I mean, I'm obviously very fascinated with the. Is there anything can we bring back, or what are we looking for? Are there any samples we can bring back to understand the geology better, or?
Yes, so at the moment, we have not come up with missions where we can bring samples, especially as I mentioned before, the South Pole. With the Chandrayaan-3 mission, ISRO had planned it in such a way that they could collect data for about 2 weeks roughly before it goes into the dark side of the moon, where temperatures would drop. So Chandrayaan-3 is actually fueled by solar panels. So it depends on at least some part of the sun, or at least the heat to run. So the thing is, we are not exactly sure what would happen after 2 weeks, because we would lose contact. And by the time we get the data, there's a delay, obviously, in the data that's being transmitted. So by the time we actually get the data, we won't know whether it survived the extreme cold temperatures. So we don't get to collect samples, because we have not so far come up. We definitely did when the US collected lunar samples. That's how we know this surface is, made of basalt, which is actually very interesting, and so on. So with the Chandrayaan-3 mission, it doesn't collect samples as such, but it definitely gives us a reading of the South Pole and what are the compounds, organic compounds that you see there.
So the window of opportunity is closing, right? And in that window of opportunity, with the latency of that X amount of period that the data is transferred, how do you when would you decide definitively that once the last batch of data is arrived, then is there going to be an inherent assumption that we think it's done its job, and that extreme temperature has taken its toll?
Yes, that's a very good question. So we have a general idea of the cycle of the moon. So we have a general idea of how long we get the data. Now, whether it's done and dusted, and we won't get anything else, unfortunately, we don't have that information until it's actually done.
Yeah.
So the thing is, only when it comes back after the next 2 weeks or 14 days, will we know if it transmits data, then it's succeeded, which would be amazing and
Of course.
also, fascinating. If it didn't, then obviously temperatures go down to -200, -300. So it just couldn't withstand, especially without the solar panels charging. We wouldn't be able to say that right off the bat.
Yeah. And it may have some, I guess, some battery pack to sustain a few hours.
Yes, yes.
Because essentially extreme low temperatures should allow the battery to last longer than the traditional sort of the temperature that we are used to on planet Earth. But in any case, I mean, it's a great sort of success. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you will be doing, and of course, collectively as a community will do. And maybe we can think of another session, Tanishta, where we can perhaps we can talk about modeling techniques or go a bit
Yeah,
deeper.
we can. We can also go about what Pavithra did in her PhD. I knew about the dichotomy, Mars dichotomy, what she
Yes.
talked about, because we did it together sometime. But then also a little bit of showing notebooks, how the data is analyzed, maybe like when you apply a machine learning, like a simple model or a deep learning model, and how you can come up with some. That would be a nice way. We can have a second session on this, I think, because and we can also show a little bit, because astrobiology, I don't know much, honestly, but it's very fascinating field, as I can see, like what are the compositions or temperature where you can have these organisms exist and all. So yeah, I think we should, it's the time constraint now, but maybe let's plan for a next session. And if you have any colleague, Pavitra, you want, they can join also in the conversation. Then we can also make it,
Absolutely.
a students also can we can make it a live conversation. So also walking the notebooks, modeling techniques, and people can ask questions.
Yeah,
That would be
sure.
a great way.
That sounds great.
Yeah, perhaps getting one of your students and who's helped participate in your projects, and then get a data science perspective as well to the astroscience perspective,
Right.
because essentially, it's whether planet Earth or any other planet, it is this pursuit of truth is fulfilling when you're able to at least have some reliable assumptions around existence, previous or future existence of life form, because that's why we are trying to explore and also trying to learn how how all these how the evolution of the planets sort of came into play. Very interesting field. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for this wonderful explanation.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to actually talk about this as well, because it's an upcoming field. So, it's definitely super fascinating. And so this was
totally
great.
Yeah, we are envious of you, but at the same time rooting for you guys. I mean, it's such a wonderful moment of pride for us to see what India has achieved, and hopefully will definitely inspire so many young kids to choose this profession. I was fascinated since I was a little kid about it, and then life takes over. You have to get jobs and move on, and then deep inside that little child wanting to explore the stars. That's been every kid's dream. So I hope this will really inspire lots of young kids to get back to science.
Yes, we've actually started our first ever master's course in astrobiology and space science. It's in India.
Wow.
So we are trying to promote the same thing you just said. So
yeah, you should also go to high schools, get them when they're, ripe and malleable,
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Pavithra. So nice to meet you. Very glad, and hopefully we'll do another session. I'm really interested in. I will try to refresh my memory and my knowledge a little bit more, and especially the experiments that I'll pull out some of my old notebooks as well, which I was doing 6 years ago, But that was purely from machine learning perspective. I was just trying to understand, analyze the data from the LIGO systems. But I'm sure astrobiology is very interesting. Very
Yes.
nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And see you
Alright.
again soon.
Yeah. See you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
See you.
Ciao.